Hello, guys, and I am really happy that YouTube has introduced me to some great people, and Jonathan Fink is definitely a friend of mine and a friend of Ukraine. Jonathan, I'm really happy that you have found some time to join us today.
I'm delighted to join you again, Anna.
And I think we will discuss one very complex and at the same time important topic. And I would like to speak with you about the Russian opposition. Just a couple of days ago, Ukrainian people reacted to the speech of the widow of Navalny in Lisbon and actually prevented her from continuing the speech because there are lots of things that contradict this normal democratic understanding of the world in the things that she expresses. But I would like to start our conversation with a question. Do you think in modern Russia, real opposition exists, an opposition not just to Putin, but to the imperial worldview of this dying federation, dying empire?
There are different shades of opinion, of course. And in fact, for people who are still in Russia, we don't know fully what people's views are because they cannot be polled in an open fashion. So Russia is something of a black box, which is difficult to have firm conclusions on. But we can analyze the speeches and sayings of diaspora Russians and those who will label themselves as opposition. And this is where I think it is difficult. There is a vast difference between how almost all Ukrainians perceive them and how people who perceive them in the West. Now, there are going to be many people, such as Bill Browder and others, who are staunchly pro-Ukraine and who advocate for Ukraine to be given all the weapons they need and say the right things in the right places about that, but who venerate the Russian liberal opposition. And when we're talking about veneration, it's usually directed at several individuals, not at the broad spectrum of Russian oppositionists. And it's usually targeted towards the Navalny team. Even though I
Mhm.
suspect many people who venerate the work of Navalny's team probably couldn't name more than two or three people from that team, although there are others. This is deeply troubling because I think it's okay to engage with the Russian opposition, but engage critically. It's important to be able to say, look, you said this and I agree with that, and you said that and I don't agree with this. It's also important, I think, to be able to demand of the Russian opposition what is their plan? What is their plan for moving away from the vertical economy dominated by a small number of people and a huge amount of Siloviki? What is their plan for moving away from Russia's extraction industries that give rise to the whole architecture of the Russian system we see? It's important to be able to ask, what is your view on Russian imperialism? Is Crimea a sandwich, or can we look at it in a slightly more grown-up way? These are important questions to ask of so-called Russian opposition, but there are two problems. These questions don't get asked. And those people, like myself, who would dearly like to ask those questions, well, we never get near the Russian opposition because almost all of them will not agree to be interviewed on these subjects. And I think it's a fundamental tenet of people who call themselves Democrats or are aspiring Democrats that they open themselves up to questioning, that they engage in debate and dialogue. This, however, I don't think is the character of the Navalny team. It's not the character of Navalna, Yulia Navalna herself. Unfortunately, it's not a character of many people that form that Russian opposition.
Thank you. And here is a question. If we have to test people, whether they are real opposition to Russia's imperial worldview, whether they are good Russians in this normal understanding of the term, what questions would you ask them to check? How do you think? What work as this litmus test?
Well, you've probably seen the film Blade Runner, where
Mhm.
they put the replicant, through a grueling series of tests to check their humanity. Um, there are lots of questions there, and if it fails, you can imagine all the alarms going off, and oh my God, it's a Russian imperial replicant, and then everyone starts shooting. But there are a series of questions. I mean, their attitude to Crimea is a fundamental one. Should Crimea be given back to Ukraine under certain circumstances? Should Ukraine be able to take back Crimea? What is the legal status of that? That's a critical question that will floor men in the opposition. There are some, such as, let's say, who's perhaps not to be classed as an oppositionist, but as a, more of a journalist, someone like Michael Naki. You could ask him the question, should Russian opposition support Ukrainian victory? Should Russians in the diaspora actually fundraise to support Ukrainian battalions, to buy drones, to equip them, and so on? Now, Michael Naki on his programs actually does fundraisers together with certain divisions of the Ukrainian army. He seeks to encourage people not to sign up, not to go to the voenkomat, not to get sent to the meat grinder under any circumstances. That for me is a clear tick. You've asked him the question, and he's actually taking action to demonstrate a very clear and principled answer. He says that Russians should not be in Ukraine. It's illegal. They've been sent to an illegal war to commit war crimes. Therefore, they are targets. They are fair targets for Ukrainians. So that is another key question. You put that same question to Navalna, and that question has been put to her. She cannot answer that. She knows that she will never, ever, ever get elected in Russia if she advocates for Russians being killed as valid targets, which they are because they're on somebody else's territory. They're in someone else's country, committing genocide and war crimes. But she cannot answer that. So for me, these are some of the critical questions. Do you support Ukrainian victory? Do you support Russians being targeted? What's your attitude to Crimea, Donbass, etc.? Beyond that, you have to start asking questions about how the Russian state itself can be decolonized. And this is a breaking point then for, I would say, most of the Russian diaspora opposition. Only perhaps Kasparov would have any answers that are at all interesting, I think, on this regard. Maybe Ponomaryov as well. But then most Russians would not see these individuals as being Russian. They would not see their views as being in any way acceptable for an ethnic or cultural Russian to espouse.
Thank you. That is actually a good selection of questions and a very wise thing that you've expressed. I remember how many people expected the first interview of Kara-Murza after his release, and we're surprised to see that he's not talking about this responsibility, collective responsibility, about Russian war crimes, and all of them tend to look just inside Russia and to speak with that potential electorate, not taking the responsibility for Russian crimes in future, when, for example, they get to control the country, they get to change the country, they are not ready to cooperate with the rest of the countries. And that is actually a test that thousands, if not millions of Russians fail. And I mean those Russians who fled conscription, who fled mobilization, not Russian war in Ukraine, but there. And now there are thousands of Russians in different countries, I'm sure in your country, in like everywhere. Have you noticed any like movements, civil, political, organized by this political immigrants, as they often describe themselves, to change something in Russia, or at least when they get the opportunity to build some alternative like parties, I don't know, governments in exile? Do you notice any of such processes taking into account the huge number of Russians that are now outside Russia and are actually capable of doing something without being prosecuted by FSB agents?
There is there is none. I would say that actually we should not be surprised at that because all organic parties. In fact, Russia has never, since sort of, 1917, has not had any kind of culture of creating organic political activity and parties that represent, say, sort of various classes and people within society. That was, to say something controversial here, that started to be quite vibrant after 1905 and was actually building up to something potentially quite interesting before it was snuffed out by the Bolsheviks who destroyed, you know, everybody and anybody that could put up any kind of, organic institutional resistance to them. So it's not totally absent from Russian history, but you have to go back 100 years to see that as a genuine organic phenomenon. In the modern era, I think all parties have been penetrated and corrupted by the Russian intelligence services. And this includes in the 90s as well. There is no phenomenon of genuine political organization, no experience of it. So I don't think we should be that surprised that it has not emerged in the West. I would also slightly take issue. They cannot set these up freely in Western societies. Why? Because their own diaspora society is completely penetrated by agents and assets. And it's like some dystopian Stanislav Lem kind of science fiction novel. Nobody in the diaspora will know well, know some of who the agents and assets are, but they won't know who they all are and who's snitching on them. So all of that toxicity, unfortunately, they're not free of it, even when they come to the West or to Uzbekistan or to Georgia or wherever. Unfortunately, they bring that kind of hell with them.
Continuing your thought, there is no way that Russians can liberate themselves because they are totally intoxicated by this reality. They travel with it. So they are never free, even in a free country. And then we have a question, how do we? What's the way then to liberate Russia? Because I believe that actually the military defeat of Russia can contribute to its future, normal future, more or less. And without it, if the world keeps choosing to protect Russia more than it protects Ukraine, this can actually lead to more sufferings, not only for countries around Russia, but for people inside. What do you think about that?
I think, and this again, this may be sort of slightly controversial, but many Russians will tell us that only Russians can fix their problems. And I tend to agree with that. So we should stop worrying about how we can fix Russia or control Russia or do anything about it. The fact is, to fix Russia in the way that we fix Germany and Japan, we would have to occupy them in their entirety, and that would require a full military defeat. So we cannot do that. There is really no chance that there's no Western politician who will sign up. They won't even at this point put boots on the ground in Ukraine, an ally, let alone envisage the full takeover of Russia. It's far more likely that parts of Russia will come under Chinese dominion. And of course, there'll be no development of democracy in those territories, although they might be a little freer to run their businesses than they are under being, governed by ethnic Russians. That aside, even if we were minded to try and fix Russia's problems, it would cost trillions upon trillions of dollars. So we simply do not have the funds and resources to fix a problem like Russia. That doesn't mean that we can't understand it. That doesn't mean we can't plan for a future Russia and whatever relations we have with that. But they need to come from a place of being well informed and from a place of being very, very cynical. And they need to come from a place of high moral values. We cannot jump back into a relationship with Russia that ignores the crimes that have been committed, that ignores the worst aspects of Russian imperialism and militarism. If we are to have any kind of relationship with the country, it can only be from a point of view where Europe is secure. If Europe is not secure, and we start dealing with Russia again, then we're simply selling ourselves to the devil. We are putting a noose around our own necks. I think that's the best we can do at this point is inform ourselves about what Russia is and how it behaves, inform ourselves about how Russians in the diaspora may present a danger to our own democracies and institutions, and deal with them on a transactional but well-informed level. And probably the best we can do with Russia is containment at this point. My belief is that if Ukraine is free and if Ukraine is strong and flourishing, then aspects of that will flow through to Russia as an example. They will see how there is a different way of living. They will not necessarily understand that immediately. It will take many, many generations. It may take centuries for those lessons to start to percolate through. This isn't a quick fix by any means, but a free and vibrant Ukraine is perhaps one of the best investments we can make for a free Russia, but that is so far down the line that we can't really plan for it. We can't control it, and we need to sort of stop deluding ourselves, or our politicians need to stop deluding themselves that somehow they can transform Russia, or that somehow they are guilty for not enabling that transformation in Russia. I hear so many people, even those who are pro-Ukrainian, talk about how we failed in the 90s. And I want to ask them, well, what could we have done differently, specifically and concretely, to transform Russia into democracy? And how much would you have been willing to spend? Because they make this assertion, which is very propagandistic, unfortunately, that we failed Russia. Okay, well, what were we supposed to do?
I have an answer. What you were supposed to do. In the 90s, when the United Kingdom, the USA, strong democratic countries, all democracies were looking for the main guarantor of peace and security in the former USSR zone, they should have picked Ukraine instead of Moscow. And we should sign Budapest memorandum with the Kremlin, like guaranteeing Kremlin security. Imagine if Ukraine was chosen as the main ally here. We would definitely protect Moldova, Georgia. Lots of countries would feel safer with us, Poland, the Baltics. And I think we should have been chosen as the main ally. And somehow Clinton, others, they chose to believe Yeltsin, and that was a great, great mistake because I think the moment the USSR collapsed, they started developing a plan how to return back all of its former republics to the dark orbit of the Kremlin. But unfortunately, we cannot change that. And what we can change is we have to be realistic and I think active and creative because what we observe right now globally, it's the reaction. Like typically, these are authoritarian regimes that take steps, like Russia inviting North Korean troops or Russia invading Ukraine, and the democratic allies, they only react. There is nothing proactive. We don't have any moves that Russia expects or awaits from us. We don't keep them anxious and nervous. What will we do? We are banned to do things. We are watching, and each reaction or each permission comes as an answer when it is already too late. When in reality, it is Russia who should nervously observe what would be the next move of Kiev, London, or Washington. So my question will be a bit creative. Let's fantasize. Uh, how do you see the next president of the Russian Federation? What is he or she? Let's imagine like the worst case scenario, the best case scenario.
Well, a lot of people say, well, what if it was someone like Patrushev? Because they immediately think that if you've got someone like Putin, it's going to be someone similar or worse. Now, from a Ukrainian perspective, there is no one worse than Putin. I would also argue there's no one worse than Putin. He's a mafiosi, but he's also, if you look back at the clips of him in the 90s, and when he first took office, he's a non-entity. He's a grey cardinal. He has no personality. He's a KGB thug and psychopath. But there's no warmth, there's no personality there. Whatever you see now in terms of his eloquence and so on, and he is eloquent in Russian, and he is able to sustain, or was able to sustain hours long, press briefings. Now we know there's a lot of manipulation and there's a lot of architecture that goes into creating those, but he still was a lot more articulate than many Western politicians. But you have to forget a lot of that. A lot of that is just makeup. You scrape it away. And he is a grey, empty vessel full of trauma and psychopathy. So there's no one really that can be worse. I don't think they would put someone like Patrushev in charge, because they know that there'll be no rapprochement with the West. They know that there'll be no lifting of sanctions, that they will be moving down the route to become a new North Korea. That is guaranteed. That's not what I think many of the elite in Russia want. They want to get back to their Italian villas. They want to be able to make money and sit on their hoard of cash and ill-gotten gains. They don't want it to be stolen and turned into a war economy. They kind of don't want these things. They want their families to be able to go and study in Western Europe and enjoy, the finer things in life. None of them want to live in North Korea. So for my money, we are much more likely to get not Yulia Navalny and others, and we talk negatively about the Navalny team and so on. But I think it's quite clear the Navalny team would not have started a full-scale war, would end a full-scale war. There's some negotiation about what they would actually do around Crimea and so on. But this is not their sort of strategy. They're not militaristic imperialists in this sense. They're, I think, sort of cultural and historical imperialists, as it were, in the sort of Russian tradition, but not in the sort of psychopathic sense of Putin. But they're not going to get anywhere near power. There's zero chance that anyone in the diaspora opposition will get near power. So it's going to be someone who is a puppet of the regime, someone who has plausible deniability of connections to the Siloviki class, but will nonetheless be a complete puppet of them. For me, it'll be someone like Ksenia Sobchak. And of course, that's deeply triggering to a lot of people. A lot of Russians as well will say, no, how can you say that she's a puppet, etc., etc.? No, she's absolutely and clearly a puppet of the regime, but a slightly more subtle one than some of the characters. There are also a whole raft of people who are fairly sort of grey, systemic oppositionists who I think could be chosen. So I think what we'll see is a so-called liberal imperialist Russian government. And that will be a ruse. That will be another way of trying to move beyond the criminality of the Putin regime to get Russia reintegrated into part of the so-called legal world of the West. But they won't abandon the shadow economy that they have created. They will not abandon that easily, because that is generating a lot of cash for them. Wagner, its operations in Africa and so on. So I think you will see a quasi, very confused sort of Russian government where the strings are fundamentally pulled behind the scenes by the so-called Siloviki class.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for this answer. And I still hope that after the defeat of the Kremlin, we may actually have more presidents on the territory of the former Russian Federation. Thank you so much for joining this conversation. And also thank you for your magnificent Silicon Curtain channel and lots of other projects that come out of your channel and our communities. Thank you for being a friend of Ukraine, and I'm sure that together, despite all the challenges, we will see the next presidents of free republics of the former Russian Federation.
I'm looking forward to the president of Yakutia in particular, and well, we could have a whole list of different nationalities who deserve their own chance to make their own mistakes, and
That can actually be the next topic of our conversation.
definitely. Anna, thank you so much for inviting me onto your fantastic channel and to be able to speak to your beautiful and very loyal community.
Thank you.